We are live now. Thanks, Michael, for joining me. Um, and as I was asking you before, you are in Boston at the moment,
I am in Boston in scenic Roslindale, neighborhood where I've lived for about 20 years.
and you split your time between there and Pittsburgh, but you also are traveling all over the world.
Well, not all over the world, but sometimes all over the world. I had a great trip to Thailand and India over December and January, and some book travel coming up, but then mostly here in Pittsburgh.
Where did you go in India?
Chennai in the sort of like the southeast coast for a family wedding. It's my first time in India, completely great, like overwhelming in all the good ways.
Yeah. I've only been once. It was a very intense 8-day trip. I actually was there as a group of LGBTQ travel writers, and it was when the country felt like they could open up because they had, undid some of the illegal things for gay people. So they had gay men, lesbians, some non-binary people. We met the gay prince,
Uh,
so that was exciting. But you have to go back now that you've been once. You're going to want to go back, right?
yeah. So was that like? No, I'd love to go back. Was it like a travel writer's junket? I mean, were you brought there by, I don't know, the tourist ministries or something?
It wasn't that official, to be honest, because they don't do that in the same way with queer travelers. But we did have a travel company that brought us because they wanted us to see what they could offer. And we started in Delhi, and then we went to Varanasi and Agra and Fatehpur Sikri and Jaipur, and it was a lot. I'll tell you more about that another time. But first, people are joining us, so let me introduce you. I'm so excited to have Michael Lowenthal here with me today. He's with our latest Queer Love Project author chat. We've been doing these pretty regularly, and I've been excited. And I got to meet Michael, what was it, a few months ago, partly because you pitched an excerpt from your book, Place Envy, which we're going to be going over today. It is now out. You just had an event in Cambridge for it, and you're going to be in New York, and you're on a book tour, so people can catch you, and we'll have all that in the notes later. But for those who don't know, Michael Lowenthal is the author of a story collection, Sex with Strangers, and 4 novels, and his writing has appeared in a slew of prestigious publications, including Tin House, Plowshares, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, Guernica, and many other publications. Plus, he has taught creative writing at Boston College and Hampshire College, and for more than 20 years, he was a faculty member in the low-res MFA program at Lesley University, which is right. I live within the Lesley University universe when I'm in Cambridge. He splits his time between Boston and Pittsburgh. And as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing his latest memoir, which is a quest and essays titled Place Envy. So thanks, Michael.
Yeah, it's a delight to be doing this.
Do you love being introduced that way all the time?
I do. And I was going to say, because I know where you live, you're really within spitting distance of Lesley University, and it's up to you whether or not you want to spit on the university. I'll keep to myself whether that's a desire of mine.
It is an enigma of a place, but I do enjoy that there's some really great Japanese restaurants in some of their buildings.
Yeah.
Uh, so, well, as people might have heard at the top of our conversation, you just got back from a big, well, you were in Thailand and in India. The book is about travel. And I guess just to kick things off, I want to talk about that. I mean, you have everything spanning a Mexican cruise for blind gay men to a remote Scottish island. And you go to these, like, let's just say unqueer places, including Bergen-Belsen, so a former concentration camp. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But just to start off, like, why? I actually was excited to realize you're in Wonderlands, which is a book that I loved when I first saw it in 2005, and I had to go back and realize, like, oh yeah, you published one of these in that back then. But why these kind of things instead of like the gay meccas or the gay hubs?
Well, actually, I talk about it a little bit in that piece that was originally in Wonderlands, and then I revised it for the new book. And um, what I say is, and I recognize there's a kind of privilege that comes with this, that I live most of my life in places where it's totally safe to be gay, and I have all those sort of comforts, and also as a gay man and somebody who can sometimes pass as straight. You might not think so, but especially when traveling in other parts of the world, it's easy for me to say this, but sometimes I want to break from being gay and from sexual orientation, and I mean, it's been so crucial in my life, especially going back, say, 30 years when the culture was different, to really claim my identity and stake out that territory and fight for it and be in the streets literally and fighting for our lives. But now that things are a little more comfortable, I just sometimes I don't want that to be the first and only thing. I want to just sort of
Hmm.
see the world and cultures and people just sort of in a different way and have people see different aspects of me. So I don't ever feel like I'm hiding exactly or
Yeah.
not, but it is really nice sometimes. And it's even really interesting. Like, I'm sure you've had this experience too, but certain places in the world, um, and actually, I felt this in Thailand just now, even though Thailand is super open and friendly for LGBT folks. But, I was with my boyfriend, and even checking into hotels, people don't actually even assume that you're a couple. And they say, "Oh, do you
Yeah.
want two beds, whatever?" And there's just something sort of liberating, which is a funny word to use because we worked so hard on queer liberation. But there's something at this point liberating about just being all the other parts of me, and then sometimes discovering the unexpected queerness in places that seemed like they weren't going to be queer, because of course, as the old cliche and truism goes, we are everywhere. And so I love sort of having it sneak up on me that way, rather than necessarily always going to the gay district or whatever, which I also do.
Yeah.
We went out in the weekend in Bangkok or whatever. Of course we did, but anyway, that's part of
Well, no, I think it's important. There's two sides to what you're saying, and I agree with you because, IGLTA, which is the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association, they work really hard in trying to educate people into not making certain mistakes and to like be able to not gender things when you're checking in. I mean, I don't know if this has happened to you. It's definitely happened to me many times where me and my husband check into a hotel and they think Mr. and Mrs. Del Real or Mr. and Mrs. Portwood, depending on who's and there's always this gendered thing, and so they've tried to get away from that, especially in many European places, but they actually still do it quite a bit too. That happened to us in Copenhagen recently. And but when I was in India, for example, one of the people traveling with us was non-binary, and they really enjoyed the fact that they were often mistaken for male when it's very gendered in India. Like there's some places where women have to cover up and men don't, and they were able to like access places as a male, which they had never been able to do in other places. And so I understand what you mean by the privilege, especially as a white cis guy. I know that we have that. And actually, years ago, when I was invited to the State Department to talk about like travel stuff for LGBTQ people, I made it very clear to them that everybody needs different things, right? Like a trans person of color is going to have different needs in the Middle East, for example, than maybe you or I would. And that people shouldn't be dehumanized and lumped together as whatever. But we'll stay out of the politics of all that because you get into plenty of that because you did something that I know that you write about. Your family obviously wasn't always excited about you and your obsession with your potentially gay uncle Peter, and you write pretty beautifully about that discovery and then going to Bergen-Belsen, and it basically opens the book and closes the book. So tell me a little bit about going there, because in some ways it almost reminded me of that Seinfeld episode of when like they make out at Schindler's List. It's like you're doing this thing that you're not allowed to do as a Jewish person. So tell me how that was for you.
Yeah, well, I'll back up, and I mean, first I'll say I'll come back. I didn't actually go to Bergen-Belsen, but took a trip to Germany and went to some other um, similar sites. But just so folks who haven't read the book know, when I was 14, my grandfather died, and I there was an obituary for him in the Boston Globe. He was a rabbi who was well known in the Boston area, and in the obituary, it said that he and my grandmother had escaped the Nazi period in 1939, which I knew. And then it said that he had a son from an earlier marriage who had died in the Holocaust, and that was news to me, even though I was 14, and just nobody had ever talked about it. Um, so Peter, who yeah would have been my uncle, my half uncle, my father's half brother, became this sort of talisman figure for me, who I was just fascinated by. And I could find out almost nothing about him, but then so he became this like figure that I could project everything onto. And you can imagine I was 14. I was just starting to be gay in my head and in my loins, but not anybody about it. Um, and so I somehow decided or fantasized really that he was gay, and that somehow that would make a difference, that to have like a gay predecessor in my family. Reflecting on it all these years later, which is part of what I try to do in the book, I sort of, I don't know, interrogate like why was that so important to me to find a predecessor? Like, what difference would that really have made in my life if this guy who I never met, who died, 25 years before I was born, if he had been gay? And eventually I became more interested in the reality of him than in my fantasies of him. Um, but and then my family did eventually take this trip to Germany, and we went to the tiny town where my grandmother was from, where none of us, had been, and where she had only been. She returned one time after 1939. She went back in the early 70s and wrote this excruciatingly moving and beautiful letter to our family. I mean, I was only 4 years old at the time, but it was actually addressed to her children and grandchildren, um, about what that experience was like for her. And in the tiny Jewish cemetery there, I had this, sort of strange um, moment of connection and wondering about these sort of 600 years worth of relatives and what it meant to be part of that, and to have this place that was really sort of mine, or was it, was sort of what I was wrestling with, when I had spent my whole life not feeling like I had a place, and I had projected all these wishes on to Peter to find a predecessor. And then I found the graves of these two other relatives in that cemetery, who suddenly I wondered if they had been queer. And again, I was sort of wondering why that was important to me. But there is this strange thing about, which I felt with Peter, sort of fantasizing about Peter, in admittedly, erotic ways. I mean, I was 14 years old. He was super handsome. We have exactly one photograph of him taken when he was, I'm sure, a teenager, because he died when he was 21, in the camps. And um, yeah, I fantasized about him, and that seems pretty like verboten, to use the German,
Mhm.
you know. Um, but I guess I hope that I tried to be honest about things like that in the book, and I wish other people would be too. Like, we can't all be completely reverent all the time, and we can't all, follow all the rules. And so you're gonna fantasize about somebody who died at Bergen-Belsen. Oh, what? Okay, just like, you know, cop to that. Or if you're gonna, giggle at a inappropriate sight, or you can't always be doom and gloom all the time. Um, yeah.
Well, but I think that you're touching on something that many people feel, many queer people especially, is looking for this connection, as you subtitled the book, right? And we do that through biological family sometime and wish that we had queer relatives or gay or lesbians in our family tree, and can fantasize about that. But then we also create found family, and we sometimes do that even through sex, right? And I know I've had sex with certain people because I feel like I'm connected to them and their kind of family tree of other luminaries, and that actually used to be a thing, that I think in the 20th century many gay men felt that way, right? Like, oh, I'm now connected to Walt Whitman because he had sex with him and he had sex with him. And I don't know. So tell me about this need for connection and searching for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, natural for all of us to want that, of course. And so many people have had painful experiences with their, biological families, their blood families, or whatever. Um, I felt it's funny that you bring up that sort of chain of association, because as you know, I was lucky enough in my early 20s to have the mentorship of John Preston, who was gay writer and editor and activist, and he talked about that a lot because he had had sex with Samuel Stewart, who had had sex with I don't even remember, but going back to
Valentino and all kinds of people,
Oscar
and
Wilde and
I think his yeah,
Garvey.
his lineage went all the way back to Bosie, who had sex with Oscar Wilde. So
Yeah, exactly. And, and then John had this. I think yeah, he wanted to convince me that that was important enough that I should want to be in that lineage by having sex with him, which actually never happened. We were very very close in other ways, but he had this wonderful idea that especially because we're so often excluded from our biological families, that it was sort of up to us as gay people to um, offer mentorship and those kinds of bonds and
mhm.
to other people. And so he did that partly through his writing and his editing. And for example, he and I co-edited a book called Friends and Lovers: Gay Men Write About the Families They Create. Um, which I finished for him after he died in 1994. But he also had this sort of explicit mentor protege project where he said to me and a couple of other people, I'll be your mentor, you'll be my protege, you can ask anything of me. And he sort of, made explicit that connection that lots of us um, do sort of just informally or implicitly in
Yeah,
lives through sex or otherwise. And that was so powerful to me. And I've tried to sort of pay that forward and find people to take under my wing too. And those are some of the most sort of cherished and meaningful relationships in my life.
yeah. I mean, and that comes through in the way that you write about several of these moments, that some of them are fleeting, right? They're not long-standing bonds. Some of them, were kind of one and done, or, like, or maybe you do keep in touch with everybody. But let's go to another essay, which is one that is pretty funny and strange, which is the Amish one, ligature. So you live with an Amish family, even though, you never really tell anybody that you're gay, and you know that that would not go over well. Um, and I'm always fascinated by this outsider status, right? Like and you being Jewish, I'm curious what you think, because I think it was actually um a Jewish artist that I was reading. I'm suddenly blanking on her name. Joan why she's the wife of Pollock, Joan Krasner,
Oh yeah.
and she wrote about being an outsider while being, feeling as an outsider within one's own country and within one's own culture. And when I read that, felt that way as a queer man. And you've done it in multiple different ways, where you have layers of outsiderness on top of that. Um, First, tell people a little bit about why you went to this Amish family and lived with them, and we obviously know it all turned out okay.
Yes, I survived to tell the tale. Um, yeah, I was 18. I was a college sophomore, and I was just inching out of the closet. I had just started hooking up with the only other gay student I knew in college, but it was totally like secret. We would sneak off and have sex. Um, and then we finally went to a meeting of the gay students groups. That was my sort of first real coming out. And at the same time, because of the oddness that of the policies at Dartmouth College, you have to take off a leave semester basically, because then you have to be on campus during your sophomore summer. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And I was a religion major, and I've always been sort of obsessed with orthodoxy, especially, and not just Jewish orthodoxy, but um, people who just live according to those strict beliefs, exactly because of what you were talking about, sort of insider outsider status, which I'll try to get to. Um, and a friend of mine had lived with this Amish family, which was very unusual and very rare that they had invited him in. And there were particular reasons. He was German. He knew how to work with horses. And so they invited him in. And I think that had sort of planted the idea in my mind. And then I watched the film Witness. And suddenly I had this idea. I know I should go live with the Amish, which, you know, in retrospect, it's like, no, that's sort of, but I don't know. It made
This is 80s or early 90s?
1988. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just made real emotional sense to me at the time. And I think what it was about was partly this whole insider outsider thing, which was like, And I went to that meeting in the gay students group, and that was like my first coming out. And like literally 3 weeks later, I moved to Pennsylvania and lived with the Amish and was obviously, completely closeted and cut off from really any notion of sex or sexuality. Um, I think I was sort of fascinated. I was thinking about what I was going to cut myself off from potentially by coming out as gay, which of course it didn't end up working out that way. I mean, I still have all but one of my family relationships, and I have so many friends, and I've completely loved my gay life. But as a terrified 18-year-old, I felt like I was drawing this line, and I might be sort of like stepping off the edge. And I also wondered if I might be joining a new community and find
Mhm.
part of a new group that I didn't really know anything about. And I was a little bit wary of what I might be sort of asked to believe in as a member of a new group. And I think the Amish represented something to me that I wanted to just sort of see up close, which is that
Yeah.
they've chosen to be absolute outsiders to society. They sort of, affirmatively made that leap, and yet within their own world, they're absolutely um, connected, and it's all about belonging and all about conformity. And conformity has always terrified me, but also in a weird way, appealed to me. Like um, I've always felt like I'm naturally an apostate, as I think many, if not most, gay people are, because we grow up and the world is, our very families, the whole world is telling us one thing, one sort of doctrine about what life is or looks like, and we know inside us that something's not connecting up. And so we have, many of us have an almost innate sense of skepticism, I think, or a sort
Mhm.
of subversiveness. um, so I wanted to look at people who really live by that, and they have all these rules, and if you break the rules, you're absolutely kicked out. And
Yeah.
so extremity, I knew my own life wouldn't be that extreme, but I thought if I could see that extremity up close, it would help me figure out something about how I wanted to be in the world. So that's the sort of the highfalutin version of it. And in truth, I just had a marvelous time. I loved those folks. I loved working on the farm. I love not having telephone and TV and electricity. And the values that I really um, saw and sort of, borrowed from them,
Mhm.
almost 40 years ago, I guess at this point, still are really central to me. And I think a lot sometimes about sort of how could I be a little more Amish in any given situation. Um, so I really am so glad I did that. I love those folks. They're still friends of mine.
Yeah. And this is actually also before things like Rumspringa and, like Mennonite and Amish culture became sort of mainstreamed, because now we have TV. I've always been obsessed with them both as well, and have known many Mennonites and had many lustful thoughts about some of my Mennonite friends. But now it might seem kind of like normal, but back then it was very exotic.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think I if you had asked 100 non-Amish people what Roomspringa meant, 0 out of 100, would have known. And people, mostly the Amish were just people who, if you happened to be in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, or in Ohio, you sort of see them in their horses and buggies, but there wasn't really, any sense of connection. So yeah, it really did feel like, I mean, and I write in the book about going to China and remote Scotland and other places. But in a weird way, the most sort of exotic place I went, I would say, was Pennsylvania, because it was just so different and so cut off. And also, in a weird way, the absolute absence of any um, discussion of sexuality. Um, just gave me this like almost like safe space when I was at this hinge moment in coming out, to just like pause and think like, okay, what is this? Who am I? And aside from my sexuality, who am I? Because I knew I would take this big leap about sexuality and sort of stake my whole life on it, really. But I mean, maybe this is going back to that question of why I sometimes want to like take a break from sexual orientation. I wanted to make sure I had a firm sense of who I was at the core, regardless of what ended up happening with gayness and coming out and sexuality. And I wanted to know that coming out wasn't going to completely change my core, that it would just make my who I am even more so, like that I could be even closer to my essential self and my essential values. So, um, but it is sort of funny in retrospect. I mean, like my other gay friends in college were like, um, as soon as they came out, they were like flying off to New York to like, go dancing and have sex in back rooms and whatever. Or other people were like, going into the streets. It was right when Queer Nation and Act Up were forming. Um, and my coming out move was to go to Lancaster County and start, working horses.
Well, you made up for lost time, but also it's good though because it didn't in some ways make you feel shame. It didn't make you feel like, oh, I'm not valuing this part of myself. And I think what comes across in all of your writing is you're deeply curious, and you also are looking for adventure and stories, right? And I think that's what keeps some of us oddballs doing that, right? And just as a quick side note, the first time I visited Belize, I didn't really know much about it, and we were not on the beach side, we were in the jungle side, and I quickly learned that there's a huge Mennonite population there, and they do all the bread and cheese, and they actually, because they were a schism, so they were too conservative for the Mennonites back home in the US, so they went to Belize. But I also wrote about it for Owl and Owl Traveler and got a lot of flack because they have a very poor human rights. Uh, they do not treat gay people well. Let's just put it bluntly. And but I still felt like you should go. Like I felt like, yeah, but having more gay people go to places where gay is not necessarily allowed helps change things. But that's also my privilege of thinking that way. So anyway, that was just a little side deviation. Um, yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at though is you're at this cusp where gay liberation was a huge thing, especially because of the AIDS epidemic and the AIDS, crisis that was happening. And so you still participated in that. It wasn't like you were escaping from it, but you did have this little other utopia for a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, and when I then came back from that, and then as I was 19, 20, 21, I became super active in, um, the gay activism on campus and then beyond campus and in AIDS activism, stuff like that. So yeah, and I feel like my, my sort of centering down and finding myself, the core of myself in that experience has actually really grounded me and helped me as I then, did come sort of flagrantly out of the closet. And, I felt like I knew it was right. I knew all the more securely what we needed to fight for. And I sort of made this, rule for myself that I would never be closeted to anybody again, except I had to carve out for my Amish friends who I still have never, had that conversation with, because I think they would have to cut themselves off from me. And if I actually believe that sort of emotionally they wouldn't want to, but they would feel that they would have to. So,
But
uh,
you allude to the fact that you feel like at least one of them kind of knows or has,
yeah,
like, intuited.
yeah, my friend who I'm closest with, for years he would call my house, and get the answering machine that's, said, "Hi, you've reached Mike and Scott. Please leave a message." And he met Scott, who was my partner once, and so he's Amish, but he's not stupid. And I'm sure at some level he figured something out, and he knows that I'm in my 50s. I've never married a woman, so and I think from his point of view, it doesn't really matter because I'm not Amish, so
Right.
those rules don't apply to me. So like I already broke the number one rule, which is I'm not Amish. So beyond that, it doesn't really matter. So he's always been generous and sweet, and he doesn't probe about it. And in a weird way, God, I feel like I'm coming across as like strangely conservative in this conversation. Which, trust me, I am not. But like I almost wish, um, sometimes there was just more like quiet understanding of, like I'm totally fine with if people have beliefs that contradict mine, as long as they don't impinge on my freedom to do whatever I want to do. I don't need everybody to like go out into the street and shout that they love gay people, whatever. Like, it's totally fine with me if people just want to have whatever kind of like quiet, loving accommodation that they want to make. And if that like allows me to have a wider circle of friends as well, I count that as a total bonus. You know what I mean? Like, sure, my like core closest friends in life are going to have to be super affirming LGBT, positive people. And I need to have queer people and trans people and everybody in my life. But to have like, other sort of like satellite friendships and stuff, some of whom have their own beliefs or whatever, like, yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think we're also both Gen X, and I think that that is something we were brought up thinking. And I've learned a lot from my millennial and Gen Z friends and students, but sometimes, yeah, I agree with you that it would be nice to can we all just get along? But that was our mantra. um, so to fast forward a bit from when you're this 18-year-old to there's a essay that you have in the book when you go to Brazil for a writing or artist residency, and that's the one that we published at the Queer Love Project. And so I'd like for you to be able to tell people about it, but also read a section from it so we can discuss. So it's called Estrangeiro, which is stranger in Portuguese, right?
Wow.
Um, yeah, so tell us a little bit about why that essay made it into the collection.
Yeah. So, I'll come at it as sort of the writerly way, maybe, since I know some of the people who tune into this, are writers and aspiring writers as well. I had this experience in Brazil that just wouldn't sort of take its claws out of me. You know what I mean? So to sort of set up, as you said, I went to Brazil on an artist residency for I think 2 months. Um, I had a long term partner at home in Boston. I think we'd been together maybe 12 or 13 years, and we had bought a house together and stuff. Um, I
That's
went,
Scott.
that's Scott. Yep. And I went down to Brazil and had this very intense, passionate affair with somebody there. Um, and I'm getting ahead of the bit we're going to read, but um, uh, I ended up going back a few times in subsequent years to visit him. And at the end of one of those visits, as I was literally, taking the bus to get to the airport, um, and I had just had this big tearful goodbye with my Brazilian boyfriend, and I was on the way to fly back to Scott. This guy cruised me at a bus stop, and we got in the bus and we sort of fooled around, and I missed my plane, and and I had this intense conversation with this guy who was a total stranger, and to your, previous point, like, never saw him again, never communicated with him again. And looking back, I was like, what was going on with me emotionally? Who was the version of me that did that? That was in love with Scott, in love with this other guy, William, in Brazil, and had just, been sobbing to say goodbye to William. And then I hook up with some stranger on a bus, between William and literally the airport, where I'm gonna, and it really wasn't. I mean, I'm all for cruising, but that wasn't really my normal MO. So I kept on for years. I was wondering, like, what the fuck was up with that? What was I doing? What was I thinking? And so that's what I sort of got into. And I originally, I mean, I'm sort of dumb when I write sometimes. I thought I could write about just that experience of cruising that guy in the bus, and it wasn't working. And then finally I was like, oh, in order to write that, I really need to write about my affair with William, because that's the context. And I wrote that in like 17 drafts, and that wasn't working either. And it was only after like months that I was like, oh, I have to write about my relationship with Scott to really provide the emotional context to explain why I was even with William, let alone why I was hooking up with some guy at the bus stop as I was leaving William. And so it really became an essay about um, love and relationships, and sort of how you find your home or your place within a relationship, and why we sometimes seek what we need elsewhere. And so, yeah, that's the idea of estrangeiro, which is foreigner, but of course,
Mhm.
cognate also is like stranger. And I was sort of playing with those various ideas and being estranged from other people, but also being estranged from like your own truest self, and how sometimes in a relationship you don't realize that the connections you made with somebody else, because they usually feel really good, also actually estrange you from yourself and what you really need. And what one hopes for, or what I hope for, is to be in a relationship where you can be totally connected with the other person and present with the other person without having to um, be a foreigner to your
Mhm.
own self. And that's how you can sort of tell when it's really working, is that you feel at home with the other person, and they help you feel even more at home in your own self. I guess that's my highfalutin way of
I
describing it.
love it. And I also think us word nerds, we get into this finding those metaphors in foreign languages as well, and it helps us, right?
For sure. And especially,
Um,
I love the false cognates, where
yeah.
um, as an outsider, you hook on to some meaning that you think is in the other language, and it's actually not really the real meaning, but it's still hard to let go of that emotional connection that you had to a word. Yeah,
In French, they taught us they're faux amis, the false friends, but they're fun. So if you would you read the section that we talked about that is in Estrangero?
I will absolutely. First, I'll show you the
Oh yes,
actual cover of my book, which I love. But I'll read because I have the place marked from the advanced reader's copy, which isn't
yeah, that I have that version too.
quite as shiny. Yeah, so this is just the section I'm going to read. I'm down in Brazil. I've just hooked up with William for the first time, or first two times. Um, and I've told William that I have a boyfriend back at home. And then I call Scott. Hooked up with any of the locals yet? Asked Scott. We were Skyping. He sat in the kitchen at our vintage dinette set, framed by walls we'd painted in a shade called Yellow Brick Road. Actually, I said, I did meet one guy. Scott was smiling, his strong jaw peppered with ginger stubble. Details? What should I tell him of William? About his trek to the island and how he'd grinned to see me as if I were the X on a map of hidden treasure? Totally up my alley, I said. Super, super skinny, tiny ass. Hot, Scott said. I waited to hear what else he wanted to know. Oh, speaking of tiny, he said, there was a baby rabbit in the front yard yesterday, but now it's gone. I worry it got eaten. I was only half listening, squeamish at having described William so reductively. It felt unfaithful to both him and Scott. But Scott hadn't even asked if I would see William again. He could not imagine how I'd use someone like William to patch over the holes in our own love.
Thanks. So first, I love the bunny detail because anybody who's in the Boston, Cambridge area knows that we all have like little cottontails in our front yards instead of rats. In New York, it's rats, and in Boston, it's bunnies at least. But before were you surprised that I asked you to read that section?
Yeah. Why don't tell me why you chose that one?
Well, I really love that last line, especially because of what you were talking about. This idea of you use the word love, and I want to talk about how you define love because some people, maybe non gay or non queer people, might not understand that you can have these multiple loves, that you can have short loves and long loves, you can have intense and you can have fleeting. And you obviously love Scott, and you as you say, you're patching over holes in your relationship with this other person, but you also said you loved William, whereas some people might say, "Oh no, that was just a fling." So I'm just curious. Tell me more. Tell
Yeah,
us more.
I don't know if I have any grand theories about it. I just sort of feel like, as the Supreme Court justice said about pornography, you know it when you see it, um, or you know it when you feel it. I really do think, like there's I'll come at it from this one angle. You know, people talk about sort of casual sex, or whatever, and as I say somewhere else in the book, for me, like, there's nothing casual about it. Like, even if sometimes it's like 15 minutes of my life or an hour of my life, um, I love sort of staying open to the idea that um, people make a mark on you in different ways, and no matter how short or long. And I sort of trust myself enough to know what feeling really counts, and sure, there's some people that come, in my life, out of my life, no big deal. And there's other people you have a connection and just, um, it goes deep. Um, and there are people who, I had a connection with at some point, and then, 30 years go by and we don't even have a connection anymore, but it still feels like it was a love, Um, so yeah, um, I don't know what to say about it any more than just, it
Then
feels
read the
like
book.
yeah, um, no, I would feel sad, and I feel like my life would be diminished significantly if I had some kind of strict arbitrary rule about what counts as love or what doesn't
Yeah.
count as love. And, without even getting into the whole, I don't know, polyamory or non-monogamy or whatever, um, I just think people make these artificial constructs about what love is or should be, or who's supposed to provide how much in your life,
Yeah.
and I think the more we can sort of open our minds about what love is, and which directions it can sort of, the multiplicity of directions it can come from, I think the better off we are.
I remember, I feel like in the '90s, there was always this talk of how love was a pie, and there was only so much of the pie that you could give away, and that if you gave away too much, there was not enough left for. And I was like, and this idea of scarcity was a big deal, and I feel like we've gotten away from that and want more abundance. But it does get into that inner core part of you thinking like, oh, if I squander the love, like, am I going to run out of it, or is it I can't give it to my core partner or something like that?
Just interestingly, coincidentally, I think just yesterday in the New York Times, there was this article about polyamory in Brazil, and that it's suddenly sort of a trend there, which is, particularly interesting because Brazil is so conservative, religiously and culturally, in a lot of ways. Just a huge Catholic population still, and then this just burgeoning evangelical population. So you have simultaneously, sort of famously open carnival and lots of,
Yeah.
but actually super, super conservative. So the folks there who are sort of pioneering the polyamory route really sort of stand out. And I thought it was really interesting article.
So you mentioned, and I love that you talked about you went through 17 drafts, and I think it's good for people to hear that because I often, with my writing students, and some people they'll write their one draft and they're like, it's done, and I'm like, no, and it takes a while sometimes to figure out what you're actually writing about, right? Like you maybe just need to get, I call it throat clearing. You just need to get it out of your system and get it down, and then you figure out what to do and how to make it better. Um, So you've written fiction and you enjoyed writing fiction. You've written nonfiction. You're back in nonfiction. Tell me a little bit one about that switch and why you felt like coming back to creative nonfiction was important.
I've been trying to figure out why that switch seemed natural to me, and why I've sort of, for the moment anyway, I just sort of have stopped thinking fictionally. I used to, see people on the T, which is what we call the subway here in Boston, depending on who's listening. And I would sort of imagine their life story or something. Or I would think about things in my own life and think, well, how could that have gone? How might that have gone differently? And then lately, I've just been thinking about actual things. And I don't know if it's related to sort of aging and nostalgia, or, just having a different perspective on things that happened a while back. But um, to me, I have a very sort of private answer to why I'm not sure it's going to be super satisfying to other people, but it's that for me, writing really, really is excruciatingly hard. And I mean, well, in the end, I enjoy it, or I enjoy having done it, but it's really, really difficult. And there just came this moment where I was, I was realizing in fiction, I was just, as you can see, I was pulling my hair out. Why it's all gone. About questions like, should I say that the character, turned left at the stoplight or turned right at the stoplight? Or, what's the background I should imagine? Should I say that they had a emotionally distant father or like a smotheringly close father? And I would rack my brains and I would give drafts to friends and they would say one thing or the other and I would try to make the decision. And it was just so hard for me that I finally realized, like, why am I killing myself to make these decisions about something that's not real? It's like it's all made up. And I love fiction. I still love reading fiction, and I have faith in it as an art form. But just for me personally, and again, I don't think this is going to be a satisfying answer to other people. But I was like, this is too hard for me to be expending this amount of my soul on stuff that is just not real. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to just actually write stuff that's true and where I know the facts, and the decisions I have to make, which will still be difficult, will only be about um, how much to tell, the order in which to tell, how to structure the piece. Um, so I sort of shifted the challenges in a way. So that's really sort of my writerly response, rather than, I don't think it's a particularly like um ideological or philosophical response.
And some of these pieces you'd written like 10, 20 years ago, or drafts of them in different versions, and now they've come together in this collection. Um, so not that we can get into great detail, I'm conscious of our time as well, but how does one know what order to put them in? Like, people always ask this question: how do you know what is the first one and what is the last one? I'm sure there's a lot that didn't make it in, or that you decided to leave out. And I actually also want to get into. I saw that one of Lynette D'Amico is here, and she actually has a book out from the same press as you. And like, was there any of that collaboration with your editors there, or how did that work?
Yeah, actually, I so first, I guess I'll say, I don't even, I should know how many pieces are in the book. It's roughly around 10, I think. And although maybe 6 of them or so had been published in different form earlier,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to tell me how many there are.
It's 10. You're right.
Yeah, so 5 or 6 of them had been published earlier, but in terms of like page count or bulk, about 2/3 of the book is brand new and unpublished. And as I was writing those sections, I was conceiving of it as a book already. But then as I was trying to put it together, it's an interesting thing, especially for this um relatively new beast that people talk about, a memoir in essays, where it really is an essay collection. Each piece has its own integrity and its own like trajectory and timeline and stuff, but they really are meant to work together and tell a sort of a coherent, consistent story. Yeah. So how do you organize them? And eventually, I hit upon a mostly chronological order, although that's not exactly the case because some of the essays, cover from childhood all the way to adulthood. Um, but the sort of sticking point for me was that a big, like, more than a third of the book is all this stuff about, we talked about earlier, me and my uncle Peter and my family and our Holocaust history and my search for a gay predecessor, and then the family trip we took to Germany to go to my grandmother's hometown, and what I discovered in the cemetery there. And that piece, as I said, was more than a third of the total book. And so it was this sort of imbalance. And it was, yeah, I thought, well, I have to have it at the front because it's really sets the table thematically. And how could anybody understand who I really am unless I discuss, and that's the piece that has the earliest like childhood and family stuff, unless I sort of discuss who I was as a teenager, But then I was thinking, well, but it has to be at the end though, because that's the one where it really, everything comes to fruition and I finally understand why I was searching for this, but why I was able to let go of that search for a predecessor. And instead of thinking of myself sort of as a genetic dead end as a gay person. I can think of myself actually as continuing the family legacy as a storyteller, stuff like that. And I come to some sort of reconciliation with my dad. And I was sort of racking my brains, and everything seemed out of balance. And I mean, in retrospect, it seems like so obvious, but I did give it to my editor at Mad Creek Books, which is Ohio State University Press, which is also just, as you said, just now publishing Lynette D'Amico's book. And the wonderful editor there, Kristen Elias Rowley, she was also wrestling with this imbalance. And then we were having a phone conversation. It sort of seemed like off the top of her head, she's like, "Well, I don't know. Have you thought about splitting up those halves of that essay and putting one at the beginning and the other at the end?" Just like instantaneously. I was like, "Thank you. You just solved my." I mean, like, and it required a little, work and setting up some things. And but immediately I thought, whatever level the book was at, it's now at, you know, level.
See, editors can be good people and have good ideas.
Right? No, 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 which I have no problem agreeing to that, because I spend, most of my work life is as an editor.
Yeah.
No, so I just, that was
But no, you should also make sure that we understand this. So you are an editor, you have an editor brain, you're also a writer, but we still need another editor sometimes to give us advice.
100%, 100%, 100%. No, I could never. I can see stuff in other people's work so clearly
Right.
sometimes. I think I'm almost overconfident as an editor. Sometimes I glance at the first page and I'm like, yeah, I know exactly what you have to do and in my own work, I cannot see it. And so I rely on friends and then editors. And I'm so grateful to her, because I really think it makes the whole shape of the book work. And already I've had, just among, the early readers, people have said that that's sort of their favorite aspect of the craft and the structure of the book, that when it comes back to that, the last 50 pages are when my family, when I'm already in my 40s and my family and I go on this trip to Germany, and it just sort of brings the whole thing back around again. So I don't generally allow myself to like be self-referentially pleased or whatever, but I gotta say, I know that was the right choice, and it's a little bit unusual, and that's sort of the aspect of the book that I'm sort of proudest of,
Yeah.
craft wise.
Well, I also want to thank you because I already shared this privately, but when you sent Estrangero as an excerpt to publish, it clicked something in my head and reminded me, like, wait, I'd written this entire memoir, and this reminds me of some of the stuff that I had written. Why did I abandon that a decade ago? And part of that was because I'd gotten some bad advice. Somebody said, "Oh, well, these stories, like, maybe you're too old to be telling these stories now that you're not, in your 30s." And it was about my 20s. But it's funny because what you said earlier about these fleeting moments and how they get in your brain. Like, I have one essay that is about this obnoxious guy that I picked up one night, this French guy, when I was living in Barcelona. And this essay is like, I'm obsessed with this person that I only knew for a couple hours and kind of hated, but he actually said some really profound things, and we had this amazing connection for a few hours. I mean, obviously people make entire movies off of that, but so I think that's something for people to think about, like, when they're processing these stories and these anecdotes. Like, I often have to tell people an anecdote is not an essay, right? Like, that's the beginning, and then you need to take it further. What do you say to your students when they come to you asking you about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me anyway, writing is all about obsession, and it has to be something, not just something that just happened to you, but something that, as I said earlier about the like hooking up with the guy at the bus stop in Brazil, something that just keeps needling at you. Like, wait, what did that actually mean? Like you experienced it, the facts of what happened, but if something happens to you and you immediately understand it, I doubt that that's going to make for good writing. It's when something happens to you and it raises more questions than it answers, and you can't figure out why you acted a certain way or why somebody else acted a certain way, or you can't figure out why you felt so strongly about something that shouldn't have been such a big deal, or conversely, if you can't figure out why you just blew something off when it should have been a big deal, and if you keep coming back to it, that seems like worthy of writing something about. And to the question of you shouldn't be writing about stuff that, or those stories are old and they happened to you when you were a kid. I I mean, I felt lucky in a way when I was in my 20s because, again, of my association with John Preston, who's writing these anthologies. I was like constantly trying to submit pieces to him. So I was having experiences in my 20s and like immediately writing about them. And, I think some of the pieces are fine, but in retrospect, they really read like, a 20 something guy's pieces. I mean, I reflected as much as I could, but I just didn't have, and the younger me would have been so vomitously angry to hear this. I did have the perspective and the wisdom and just the life experience under my belt to ask deeper questions and to interrogate my own role more deeply and be more skeptical of my own choices. Whereas now, looking back 30 years, 20 years on certain experiences I had, I really feel like I can bring something more to the table. And I may say the same thing, 30 years from now, should I live that long. And I think of so many of my favorite writers and favorite books. I mean, I'll name one, So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell. Probably if I had to pick a favorite novel, it would be that. And he wrote it as an old man. And a lot of it is about when he was a young child and his mother died in the flu of 1918. And then there was this, and the book is like right on the border between a novel and a memoir. And there was a murder in his town, and he was sort of friends with the son of the murderer. And not a spoiler, but basically, like the much of the novel really revolves around, or like the climactic moment in the novel is he looks back on this moment in high school when he walked past that boy in the high school corridor and didn't say anything to him. It doesn't sound like a very dramatic plot, right? Somebody didn't say something to somebody in the high school corridor, but because of time and distance and memory and emotion and the wisdom of gained experience, that's where all the richness of that is. And so, yeah, I mean, is anybody gonna say to William Maxwell, "Oh, that happened when you were a kid. That's an old story. That's not worth writing about." So, I for one, am on the edge of my seat waiting for your stories about things that happened many years ago because I know that the perspective you bring now would be, like totally compelling and revelatory. I'm sure.
I hope so. From your mouth to some editor and publisher's ears. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up. I want to thank everybody who's joined us for the live chat. And if you're not already a subscriber and you're listening or watching this on another platform and you're not a subscriber to the Queer Love Project, I just want everyone to know that you can find us at queerloveproject.substack.com. It's free to join and subscribe and get all the goodness that we're putting out every week. You can read Michael's essay on our site. You can read hundreds of others. We've already published over 100 essays. We're also going to be at AWP the March 5th through the 7th in Baltimore. If you're there, we're going to have a reading. And actually, if you're listening to this soon, we have a reading in Somerville on February 22nd at Narrative Bookshop, which is a new bookshop in Davis Square. So we're having our real life events as well. So Michael, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today, and everybody. Place Envy. This is the advanced reader copy, but buy the other copy for the ebook. And anything else you want to tell people before we say goodbye?
Um, well, depending on when people are listening to this, I'll just say I've got a few events coming up you can find on michaellowenthal.com, including Saturday the 21st in Brooklyn and Sunday the 22nd in Manhattan. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for this great conversation. But thanks a lot for the work you're doing with Queer Love Project. I love it. As you know, I was just a fan and submitted to you. We had never met before that because
Yeah.
it's just one of my favorite spots on the interwebs to that's meaningful to me. So thanks for the good work.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you were willing to be live on a camera on your phone. I know not everyone loves it, but it's what we do now. So,
My friends would not approve, but don't tell them.
all right. I'll see you later and good luck with everything. Bye.